Hi, good evening and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us at tonight's China Town Hall event. This is the first time that I've done this over the internet in this way. It's the first time I believe that this event has been held anywhere outside of either the United States or China. Um, but it is an event that's been going on in one form or another for about 15 years, and at which I've spoken in other contexts and in other formats in the past. What I think is particular about today, and what is different about the tenor of the discussion today from previous years, is that many people have come to recognize or believe that China's rising power and geopolitical influence has changed in some fundamental way the basic dynamics of how it relates to other countries in the world, notably in the context of today's event, the United States, but more broadly as well. This has called into question, again, for many people, not all, the previous consensus in many countries, again, notably in the United States, that the best policy for engaging with China is, in fact, one of engagement, or as was often referred to, constructive engagement or comprehensive engagement. In other words, the thinking went that by dealing more comprehensively with China, by speaking to China, by exchanging views, by engaging with China in terms of trade, other sorts of exchanges, this would be the best route to understanding China's positions and also to potentially helping nudge China in directions that other countries might hope it would go. In fact, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, which has sponsored the China Town Hall all these years, and including as well today, has long been one of the foremost champions of the engagement perspective. As I think they may mention later on in this program, the National Committee, in fact, organized famous things like ping pong diplomacy, so-called in the early 1970s, and was among the groups most instrumental in helping to smooth certain aspects of the run-up to normalization of U.S.-China diplomatic relations in the late 1970s, 1979, actually, when that came to be. In addition, since then, the National Committee has been for a long time a primary agent of what could be called track 2 dialogues or informal exchanges outside of direct diplomatic talks. So that's sort of their point of view, certainly, and the point of view of many in the field of studying China and working on Chinese foreign policy or on foreign policy of different countries looking at China. But is engagement still the best policy? I think that's what's really in question now, right? Is it still the best way to relate to China for countries like the United Kingdom or the United States or others to seek this kind of comprehensive engagement rather than something more directly confrontational or just disengage or some mixture of the two, right? So if we do keep engaging, what are we going to gain? We being, in this case, other countries dealing with China. What if the world is actually headed for a new Cold War? Some people have been talking about that recently, that if China is in fact growing in power and influence, that we may be sort of headed for the precipice of a new division of the world into two camps, a Chinese camp or China-leaning camp, and either a US camp, Western camp, whatever you want to call it, opposed to that, the status quo power and set of status quo allies versus a rising power seeking to disrupt or revise the world order. How would we know that we're there or not? Do we know? Some people think we're already there. Some people think we're not headed there. Some people think we might be headed there. But how would we know if we're actually in that reality or not? Is there a signal we can look for? And might there be such a signal now, either that we're in that space or headed that way or not headed that way? About 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, almost 25 years ago, a very famous and influential book was published by John Mearsheimer called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And in that book, the author predicts that as China rises and grows in power and influence, it will almost inevitably come to be a global challenger to the United States, precipitating another round of essentially bipolar competition, right, in which the world divides into groups clustered around the two poles, China on the one side, the United States on the other, and comprehensive competition throughout the world is what we see for years and years, reminiscent of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. But is bipolar competition the only possible outcome? Is it possible we might be headed towards something else? But what if China doesn't keep rising? If we're not already in the world of bipolar competition, in other words, if China doesn't keep growing, doesn't keep gaining influence, but maybe starts declining or losing influence, maybe it already has, would that mean that we're headed for something other than bipolar competition? Maybe, right? So, for example, China is beset by myriad internal problems and weaknesses rather than simply being a paragon of monolithic strength. And I'm happy to talk more about that at the end when we come to question and discussion time. But suffice it to say for right now that the edifice of Chinese power is more riddled with holes than it might appear from a distance. And in fact, the weakness of China is as big a story as its strength, particularly internal weakness and vulnerability. This is something that I believe the Chinese government is quite aware of and concerned about, but it's something I don't believe a lot of observers overseas look at or perceive with great acuity. What about another idea, though? What about if China does keep rising, does keep growing, does keep gaining an influence, but we don't head from bipolar competition? Let's imagine for a moment a world that is multipolar rather than bipolar, where it's not just the United States and China as poles, but there are additional poles out there in the world, poles around which other countries might cluster or that might contend for global power and influence. In fact, this is the reality that most scholars and policymakers and those with influence in China contend is likely to arise. They believe, or claim to say at least, claim to believe that multipolarity is in fact the intended or desirable equilibrium that the world could reach that would be more stable and more peaceful than a bipolar competition. Most scholars and policymakers on the US side, as far as I can tell, however, believe the opposite. They think that a multipolar world is unlikely to arise, that multipolarity is inherently unstable, that the kind of balance of power logic that underpins a multipolar world is not very compelling, and that bipolar competition, bad as it is at least predictable and relatively stable. So, but this is, I think, an open question. If we look at countries like, say, Russia, which is still a global power, even though it has declined and continues not to really grow, but it's certainly not a weak player in the world. If we think about other countries like India, that may come onto the scene in a stronger way even than it already has, maybe even more so than China. If we conceive of places like Japan, playing more of an independent and assertive foreign policy and security role than they have, it is possible to imagine a world that isn't just bipolar, where we have 5, 6, 7 powers maybe contending for influence, even if they're not all exactly evenly arrayed or evenly matched in terms of their power. They still have sufficient resources and sufficient influence to attract allies and to challenge one another and to be essentially immune to threat from any one of the others, if not collections of the others. A multipolar world is very different in every aspect than the bipolar world that's often assumed by many people looking at these sets of issues. But even if we assume bipolarity is a given, right, that we're going to end up in a bipolar world, is it inherently competitive? Some people, particularly those who continue to advocate for more engagement in China foreign policy or in foreign policy towards China, tend to seem to say, at least, that We are headed for a bipolar world, but it doesn't have to be competition. We can have bipolarity, but somehow bipolar coexistence or something like this, right? This is essentially, at least from my reading of it, the policy articulated by the current US administration and some others as well. That what they're hoping for is a kind of peaceful coexistence and maybe even collaboration on some issues like climate change and fighting the global pandemic, for example. But this underlying bipolar reality that we have to maneuver around, if that's feasible. Some others would say you can't have bipolarity without competition. So I think this is, again, an open question to think about. But then what does all of this mean for the UK as distinct from the United States? After having left the European Union, part of British foreign policy appears to be an attempt to balance between the European Union and the United States. This certainly seems to be what the current UK government is looking to do in terms of trade and across a number of other foreign policy issues. But is it viable to think about that in terms of China policy? I'm not sure. Possibly particularly when it comes to trade. Right? The UK has not been so quick to opt for the sort of punitive tariffs that the Trump administration did, placed on China during its time in office, and that in fact the Biden administration has not completely rolled back. But at the same time, the United Kingdom is much less sanguine about developing deeper trade links with China in comparison with, for example, Germany or even France and other major economies of the Eurozone. So I think it's very much an open question, the degree to which the UK can play a kind of balancing role between Europe and America when it comes to China. One area of interest in the media recently has been the so-called AUKUS agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States to provide nuclear submarines in the Australian Navy. That may be part of a new general agenda of foreign policy towards China, of a new posture, at least in the security area, on the part of the UK as well as the other participants. But more broadly, if we think about the sort of grand level question, can and should the UK necessarily seek a China policy that is distinct from America's? Maybe that depends on whether we're in a bipolar or a multipolar world. In a bipolar world, I would venture to say that the United Kingdom and the United States are almost certainly clustered around the same pole, and it's not the China pole. In a multipolar world, however, there's much more room for maneuver, both in security issues and in the economic area, in which the United Kingdom might usefully find policy spaces distinct from those occupied by the United States that would advance its own national interests without in any way detracting from those of its ally. So I think that's worth thinking about, and I don't have a definitive answer for you to that question at the moment. And so before going to the presentation from the National Committee and the journalist Fareed Zakaria, I would just say, as we watch this, there is a tab at the bottom of your screen labeled Q&A. So if you have questions or comments, please do click on that tab and type them in. At the end of the segment from the National Committee, I will try to take as many questions as I can before we wrap up. And with that, I will go ahead and transfer over to that segment now.
For more than 50 years, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations has been the leader in promoting mutual understanding between the United States and China, the most important relationship of the 21st century. The National Committee strengthens that relationship by helping people on both sides of the Pacific to understand one another better and to address issues of mutual concern through exchanges, dialogues, and other activities. These programs address key issues, such as economic relations, rule of law, security, public health, and the environment, in the belief that constructive Sino-American relations benefit both countries as well as the global community.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all of you joining us live across the United States, China, and this year in the United Kingdom. I'm Steve Orleans, President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I am pleased to welcome audiences from 88 venues to our 15th annual China Town Hall. Before we begin, I would also like to take a moment to express our condolences to the family of a close friend of the National Committee, General Colin Powell. We all mourn his passing. U.S.-China relations are at a crossroads. The last 4 years have seen ties between our two countries reach lows not seen since before the establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and China in 1979. As the relationship undergoes enormous changes, the major constant is that all agree that U.S.-China relations will help determine the peace and prosperity of the 21st century. Through these changes, the National Committee has steadfastly believed that understanding China and crafting good policies based on that understanding would make Americans more prosperous and secure. We started China Town Hall 15 years ago in the hope of educating Americans throughout the country about China. Over the years, we have hosted former presidents, secretaries of state, national security advisors, and ambassadors to China. This year, for the first time, we have invited a journalist to serve as our speaker. At a time when all too often traditional media focuses on the headline and a 3-minute story, Dr. Fareed Zakaria looks at the issues in depth and truly educates his viewers. This should come as no surprise, as Dr. Zakaria is the award-winning host of Fareed Zakaria GPS for CNN Worldwide, a Washington Post columnist, and a best-selling author of 7 books, including the recently published 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. We are thrilled to have him here with us today, and I am happy I can play Fareed Zakaria to Fareed Zakaria and interview the interviewer. I would also like to thank our speakers at our 88 venues who are leading voices on U.S. foreign policy in China, as well as our partners across the United States and China for hosting this event. Thank you also to the Henry Luce Foundation for its continued generosity in funding China Town Hall, and to our National Committee staff for working tirelessly to coordinate this event. Fareed, thank you so much for being here. Let me jump right into the questions. As I mentioned in my introduction, this is kind of the low point for U.S.-China relations since before we established diplomatic relations in 1979. Should the average American be concerned? How does it affect the average American's lives?
Well, first, thanks for having me. Steve, it's a huge pleasure to be here. Yes, I think the average American should be concerned because the cliches are true. This is going to be the most important relationship of the 21st century. It's going to define the 21st century. It's the biggest new thing that has happened to the international system, really in 100 years, right? If you think about the rise and fall of great powers as being one of those great engines of change, turmoil, revolution, well, the rise of China is on that scale. 20 years ago, China was 1% of global GDP. It's now about 15% of global GDP. There's virtually no country has had as dramatic a rise. And it's probably headed toward 20% of global GDP, which is roughly where the United States is. So the 21st century is going to be defined by these two powers. And what's interesting is you'll notice after the two of them, there's a big drop-off. So China is the number 2 economy in the world, but it's larger than number 3, number 4, number 5, and number 6 put together. Similarly, defense budget. The US is, of course, number 1, China is number 2, but the Chinese defense budget is larger than the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th put together. So that's why I tend to think we're back in a bipolar world. You know, a world in which these two superpowers, one clearly bigger than the other, the United States by far the number 1, but they outrank everyone else. And the question for the 21st century is going to be, can these two superpowers find a way to coexist, to cooperate, to compete, but to do so within the framework of a strategic relationship that recognizes there are huge costs to going down a path that leads us to another Cold War. And if we can get that right, and this is on both sides, this is not, you know, we tend to often think of as though America is the only actor here. Obviously, China gets a vote on this too. But if we can do that, I think you could imagine a 21st century that's quite different from one that ends up being filled with arms races, conflict, proxy wars. You know, that's the thing people forget about the Cold War is the degree to which it transformed and warped not just international life, but the life of every, you know, the average person in these countries. And so those are the stakes. We're going to live in a bipolar 21st century. Bipolarity is a given. A Cold War is a policy choice for both countries.
But would you say we are in a Cold War now?
No, I don't think.
It's a long discussion in
I think that
newspaper these days.
So the fundamental structural driver of the Cold War was, let's remember, Stalin's decision to essentially invade all of Eastern Europe. Not quite invade, but the Red Army had liberated those places from the Nazis to install puppet regimes there, then to try to go south into Greece and Turkey. And that then provokes a reaction from Western Europe and the United States, and thus begins the Cold War. So when you think about China, it has not yet done anything on that scale. And more importantly, the Soviet Union and the United States were kind of hermetically sealed from one another economically, even culturally, even during World War II. The peak year of trade between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War was about $2 billion of trade a year. The United States and China do $2 billion of trade every day. Right. And even, it might surprise people watching to know, in the last couple of months, we have been buying more stuff from China rather than less, despite all the geopolitical tensions. And that gets at a kind of fundamental reality of today's world, which is it is deeply interdependent in a very complicated way. So, you know, nobody decided that they wanted to have closer economic ties with China over the last 3 months. In fact, both sides have, you know, in many ways, the governments are trying in their way to untangle themselves a little bit. But here's what happened. Americans stopped going to the gym and started to buy Pelotons. Well, guess where Pelotons are made? They're made in China. So you see, we're both locked into such an interdependent relationship that things happen without anyone wanting them to. And by the way, that's one of the glories of the complexity of a kind of open trading system in the world, that, you know, you can get stuff from everywhere, you can interact with lots of people. And if we did really go down the path of a Cold War, I think all that would unravel. It would become, you know, and in the worst case scenario, we go back to isolated, autarkic economies and a huge amount of conflict and confrontation.
Your defense statistic is interesting because I often hear it that the United States defense budget exceeds the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh countries combined. But you talk about it that China's exceeds those next five also, which is a very different way of looking at it.
That also happens to be true. The U.S. is so much higher. You know, I mean, the U.S. spends about $750 billion. China spends about $250 or something like that. And then it really drops off, as you can imagine. Yeah. But and it's important to point out, you know, the Chinese have been building up. They've been expanding their military spending significantly. So it's not that there aren't reasons to be concerned. And again, it's not that the Chinese have not done things that should cause alarm. They have, and particularly under Xi. But the question is, do we have, for the United States, this is a very difficult challenge. The United States is very comfortable historically either withdrawing from the international system or dominating it. Withdrawing from the international system is Washington's farewell address. Just, keep out of that damned European continent with all its ills and duplicity and Machiavellian machinations. John Quincy Adams says, we don't want to go around the world looking for monsters to destroy. Domination is post-World War II, right? We basically built the international system in our image. The challenge is going to be for the next 100 years, maybe, we're going to have to find a way to live within a system where we're still number one, but we don't embody the system. We're not so far above everybody else. And China, in that sense, becomes the principal country that is a rival. In some ways, we've had it lucky. In the last 60 years, 70 years, the two countries that rose economically to quasi-great power status economically were Japan and Germany, both in a sense returning. But it didn't change the geopolitics of the world at all because both were American allies. Both existed within the American security umbrella. Both were closely tied to the US by treaty. So China is really the first great power to have risen into this post-World War II system that we built that is not a Western ally, that is not an American, honestly, the Japan and Germany could be described as American satellites.
Yeah, and both were functioning democracies. Right. Which perfect lead into the first question from the audience, which is from Daniel Yu of the American Bar Association. And he asks, how do we balance our economic and business interests that you've referred to, desiring Chinese cooperation on global health and climate change, and China's potential threats towards Western values, such as human rights, democracy, regional and international peace? And obviously he's referring to Hong Kong and Xinjiang also.
It's a big question. In a way, it is the central question, which is, it's almost asking, how should we conduct our relations with China given the opportunities and the challenges, right? So the way I would put it is, I think that there are some areas where you have to search for a win-win solution and for cooperation with the Chinese because everyone is better off that way. Trade is a perfect example. The Chinese do cheat on trade and they are protectionist on trade. By the way, so are we. The United States, Europe have massive agricultural subsidies, for example. We have all everything the Biden administration is doing with regard to this Build Back Better plan, the Buy America provisions in that, are protectionist. They are against the spirit of the World Trade Organization. They would probably be found in violation if somebody brought them, So there's a very good tally of this, and it points out in the last 20 years, the US has put in place more protectionist measures than any country in the world, very much including China. China is not even second. I think it's Brazil, India, then maybe China is seventh. So China has many non-market features that are a huge problem. But I believe that there are win-win solutions here because the Chinese also want trade. They also want to be able to be a player in a system in which they're increasingly moving up the value chain. So do you know who the largest filer of patents as a single company in the world last year was? Huawei. So China is now getting to the point where it doesn't want intellectual property stolen because it's generating a lot of intellectual property. So there's that whole bunch of areas where there are real disagreements. The obvious thing to do is for the US, Europe, and Japan to get together, come up with a common negotiating position and push hard with the Chinese. Then there are areas where the Chinese are trying to erode the basic norms, values of the international system. Human rights, the issues relating to whether or not there should be pushback from outside the world when you renege on a treaty or an agreement like Hong Kong, which it does not have some kind of clear legal status, but the Chinese government did promise in the handover documents to the British that they would honor a kind of one country, two system model, which they have not. So on those ones, I think the United States, the West in general, should stand tough. I mean, I think we should not compromise. We should not pretend these issues don't exist. We should air the differences. We should, hold them accountable in the sense that we can. Again, always better to do this with other countries than by ourselves. But I fear that this balance that the question was asking about is politically very difficult to do. When Truman outlined to Senator Vandenberg, the Republican whose support he was trying to get, that he wanted to have a strategy towards the Soviet Union that we would now call containment, Vandenberg said to him, Mr. President, the only way this will work is if you go on TV and scare the hell out of the American people. Otherwise, we're not going to be. And my fear is that, in order to get some of the things people want to get on the more confrontational side, you're going to exaggerate the threat, minimize the areas for cooperation, and that could lead us down a very dangerous path. Because one thing we must always keep in mind in this conversation is China is not some inanimate object out there. It's got its own politics, it's got its own culture, it's got its own society. So when we do things, it has an impact on them.
Yeah. Yep. Let's go to our first question from the audience, from Catherine Ng, who is right here in New York City, and she'll be on video.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm calling in from New York City. My question is about U.S. shifting Asia priorities and relations with Europe. Since the Obama administration, the U.S. has been trying to pivot to Asia, but without too much success. We're now at a moment where the country is able to shift more completely to Asia, but is also straining alliances along the way. For example, we withdrew from Afghanistan, but at a bit of a cost there. The US signed an AUKUS deal that left France upset. It seems like in the Biden administration's hurry to tee up the China strategy and compete with China, that it's causing Europeans to feel the relationship with the US is a bit transactional, and perhaps it's fueling strategic autonomy as well. And yet, a strong European coalition is necessary to effectively confront China. How would you evaluate Biden's China policy as it currently stands? Thank you.
Sure, it's a good question. I would say that she accurately described some of the costs along the way as the Biden administration has been trying to pivot to Asia. And she points out the pivot really began with Bush, the younger Bush's outreach to India with the nuclear deal, which was a big, an extraordinary reversal of U.S. policy. For 35 years, we had punished the Indians for having a nuclear weapon, and then we normalized it, and it was largely because there was the desire to bring India into the fold. Then the Obama pivot to Asia, so articulated, putting troops in Australia, a kind of base in the Philippines, all of which then led to what the Biden administration has tried to do. As usual, Trump is a kind of weird aberration where he doesn't really quite have a policy. It's schizophrenic. One day he loves Xi Jinping, the other day he's bashing him. I would say that the Biden policy is very much a continuation along these lines. And yeah, there was some bruised feelings. Some of those you could have dealt with better. The Afghanistan withdrawal could have been handled a bit better. The AUKUS deal could have been handled better. But the fundamental direction, I think, is correct, which is that the United States should be shoring up the alliances in Asia that will allow it to deter Chinese aggression, to maintain an American presence in the Pacific. And by and large, I think the driver there has been Chinese behavior. So you look at two places in particular, Australia and India. In both cases, the Australians were trying to play a game of having it both ways, of having very close economic ties with the Chinese and close geopolitical ties with the Americans. The Indians were trying to be very passive, and they were willing to kind of go along with things like the Quad as long as there was no military component, as long, they would often send a very junior minister to those meetings. And then the Chinese under Xi became, much more aggressive, issuing the set of demands to Australia, in the case of India, having that border skirmish. And in both places, the domestic politics have changed. As a result, the foreign policy has changed. And there is much more of a sense of kind of inviting the US to play a role to help these countries feel like they're not on their own. So I think it's, broadly speaking, been successful. One point I'd make about Europe, yes, we need to make sure that there's a way to pivot toward Asia that is both taking the Europeans along and through Europe in a sense, as opposed to against Europe. There is going to be some concern on their part that they're being abandoned. I think it's actually, the way to point it out is it's largely good news. It means Europe is not the cockpit of potential war. I mean, that was the issue in the Cold War, was people worried that the Soviet Union was going to move millions of men through Europe, through the Fulda Gap in Germany to kind of conquer Europe. That concern is largely gone, though of course Putin does represent a threat to places like the Baltic states and Poland and Ukraine. But the action has moved to Asia, so naturally US foreign policy should move there. Europe will never act, final point, because you mentioned, Europe will never be a strategic actor. That is a bridge too far. It is an extraordinary, the European Union is an extraordinary achievement, the most extraordinary sustained institutionalized cooperation among countries that have fought each other for 400 or 500 years, but they will never become one country. I mean, Berlin and Paris will never subcontract their foreign policy.
We have a question relating to the increase in kind of anti-Asian violence in the United States, anti-Asian activity in the United States, from Alice in Austin, Texas.
I'm Alice E. from Austin, Texas. I plan to watch the town hall with our Austin Asian Community Civic Coalition members. Here are my questions. FBI wrongfully accused many Chinese scientists before, like Wenho Li, Sherry Chen, and many, many more. If U.S.-China relationship going backwards, what challenges are we going to face as a Chinese American living in U.S.?
Yeah, it's a very real concern. Part of it is that once you sharpen the divisions and the geopolitical tensions rise, it becomes much easier for people to start suspecting and being suspicious and casting doubt on the loyalty of Chinese Americans in ways that are completely unfair. You already see it happening. People like Mike Pompeo and other Republicans have been accusing universities of becoming hotbeds of spying activity. Again, very rarely do they have specific charges or let alone proof, but these are easy things to say. And I think we should be aware that this is a challenge that Chinese Americans have faced almost uniquely among Asian Americans because of the Asian Exclusion Acts, the Chinese labor that was brought in, the way in which they have been historically discriminated against. So it's very easy to bring up, if you scratch these tendencies, it's very easy to bring up a certain amount of racism and xenophobia. I worry a lot about this. If you look back over American history, America reacts badly when it gets scared. When we get scared, we lash out, whether it's at the Irish, Jews, the Chinese, the Red Scare, McCarthyism, even after 9/11, some of the attacks on Muslims. If we were instead, again, to be calm, sensible, pragmatic, understand this is a challenging relationship, it's not just better for the relationship, better for the world, but we don't distort our own values and our own society in the pursuit of some confrontation abroad.
Yeah, I think the good news on this is that the Asian American Pacific Islander community has actually begun to organize, and we've seen responses. You know, some charges have been dropped. We saw this case at the University of Tennessee, Professor where the federal judge ultimately threw out the case, and then this past weekend, the University of Tennessee reinstated the professor. So we're beginning to see progress, and we're seeing letters from Stanford, from MIT, professors at Stanford, from MIT, objecting to using race or Asian heritage as a basis for any kind of investigation. Let's talk a little bit about, you wrote this very interesting piece about normalizing many of the Trump, last month, normalizing many of the Trump administration's foreign policies. And you talk about Cuba, you talk about Iran, you talk about others. But for China, so tariffs, delisting of Chinese companies from U.S. stock exchanges, visa restrictions, journalist restrictions, state-owned media restrictions in the United States. Why are these still in place?
There's something about Donald Trump that I think people most don't quite understand. He's very clever and in sensing the political mood. So in all of these areas, Cuba policy, Iran policy, and China policy, he changed the default position. He changed the operating position. And it turns out it's politically very hard to reverse it, because take Cuba as a simple example. If Biden were to try and reverse Cuba policy right now, Senator Robert Menendez, the ranking Democrat the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, would be appalled. He's very hawkish on Cuba. Now Biden needs his vote on these two big bills that are coming up, right? So on China, I think that Biden criticized the tariffs throughout the campaign, in my opinion, completely correctly and intelligently, pointing out, A, Americans were paying the cost for the tariffs, 100% right. B, they were not working, 100% right. And C, by the way, you could point out that it hasn't changed Chinese behavior at all. But were he to reverse them, you will see the barrage of tweets from Marco Rubio and Josh Hawley and things like that. Now, my own view is that is a mistake, because I think that, first of all, policy toward China is too important to play the politics with. You should try to figure out what the right thing to do is and do it. And secondly, those guys are going to attack you no matter what. I don't think I need to tell President Biden, we're living in a very polarized country. And if he wants to get a glimpse of that, watch the way in which Republican senators reacted to Biden's summit meeting with Putin, which was a pretty normal summit. They exchanged the usual free and frank exchange. The Fox News and Republican senators literally described it as Munich, as Biden having appeased Putin in a way that was going to lead to a world war. It was fantastical, right? And so if you're going to get attacked as being Neville Chamberlain at Munich, when you have a routine bilateral with Putin, you're going to be attacked on your China policy no matter what. So you might as well do the right thing, because you're going to pay the political price of being pummeled from the right anyway.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the actual inflation that is now occurring in the United States, combined with the beginning of the progressive Democrats advocating for an ending of the tariffs because of their regressive nature, the people who are most affected by these tariffs are poorer Americans? Do you think we'll see a reversal of that? And we're seeing Ambassador Tai speaking with Vice Premier Liu He. You think we'll see some of these tariffs get ended?
I think you're beginning to see the reestablishment of real dialogue, which is very good. You're seeing the reestablishment of some kind of strategic relationship. I still think the Biden administration doesn't know how to handle the politics of the China relationship. Look, to be fair to them, part of the problem is they will have very few allies on the Democratic side either. You look at Chuck Schumer, you look at Nancy Pelosi, You're not going to find, there used to be in the US Senate in particular, a kind of group of wise men who had a broader strategic national security orientation, the Sam Nunns of the world, the Daniel Patrick Moynahans of the world, Lugar, and people like that. Those people don't exist anymore. And so what you have now is a much more political, partisan Senate. And so I think Biden is trying to figure out whether or not there's space there. My sense is maybe they would do it in the context of some kind of overall agreement where where the Chinese also make some concessions. But unfortunately, I don't see much movement. And as you say, it's highly regressive. These tariffs are basically taxes that are paid for by middle class and working class Americans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in an inflationary environment, it's a good way to actually reduce pressure for inflation. Let's talk about some of the shared challenges that the United States and China are confronting, especially climate change. We have questions. We have a partnership with the Schwarzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua University, and two of their students have submitted some questions on the topic of climate cooperation. So if we could hear from them.
Hi, Fareed. My name is John Rendon. I'm from Brooklyn, New York, and the 5th cohort of Schwarzman Scholars. I'm here representing Meetup Chinese Group in Charlotte, North Carolina. My question concerns climate change. In the past, we heard climate change mentioned alongside pandemic control and prevention as an area where the United States and China, no matter their differences, could cooperate and find common ground. Yet the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic showed us that the differences between China and the United States state interests and government systems made that cooperation very difficult, if not disappointing. Why should we expect climate change to be different? Thanks.
Hi, my name is Alliance, and I'm currently a Schwarzman Scholar at Tsinghua University residing in Beijing, in China. Leading up to the COP26 conference at the end of this month, my question is, knowing that both China and the US are global superpowers with key roles in helping achieving a net zero future, so what are the immediate actions that both countries have to take in order to ensure that we're en route to a sustainable climate change future? Thank you.
Well, they're both very good questions. And the first one pointedly says, why has this been so difficult? And I think the reason it's difficult is because it's actually not an area where you are going to get much because of a treaty or an agreement between the two sides. On this issue, I dissent a little bit from the conventional wisdom. The Chinese are going to do what they want to do and what they need to do to get their emissions down for their own reasons. They're not going to do them because the United States forces Beijing to do it. And the same is true of the United States. These are decisions largely made by countries because of their own sense of commitment and political pressure or societal pressure. And the Chinese have been doing a certain amount because there has been a lot of concern in China about dirty air and dirty water and such. But I don't quite see where the opportunity for a win-win here is, in the sense that the Chinese are going to reduce emissions if they want to, and the Americans are going to reduce emissions if they want to, and maybe they'll get together in places like Paris, the Paris Accords, which are entirely voluntary, and they can symbolically commit to them. I think that the area for cooperation would be really if there were efforts to help the poorer countries in the world get to green energy faster, and rather than being completely competitive about it, to find ways to help with project financing and things like that. Right now, we're going about it in an entirely competitive way. The Chinese do their Belt and Road Initiative. The United States is trying to offer various other forms and is trying to counter that. That's probably suboptimal. But I have to say, my biggest concern right now about climate change, this takes us off the topic of US-China slightly, but is we are all committed and committing to a world in which we are going to phase out these fossil fuels very fast. And so there's very little investment going in, a lot of shaming of it, a lot of winding down of natural gas, for example, in the US. But we don't have green technology at the scale we needed. And most importantly, in what utility would call in terms of base load capacity. In other words, the always-on energy that an electric utility needs to provide electricity when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. And right now, what you're seeing are very big gaps between, you're winding down fossil fuel, but you're not ramping up. We can't ramp up green enough. That's why you have these blackouts in places like California. That's why you have this energy crisis in Britain. My fear is this is not something you can just aspirationally wish for. It needs a lot of very careful planning. If you are going to take one power plant offline because it's coal-fired or natural gas-fired, you have to have something that replaces it kilowatt for kilowatt. You have to find those sources, and if you can't find them, you have to keep the fossil fuel on for a little bit longer, move from coal to gas because it's half the emissions. These are difficult trade-offs, but with regard to this subject, people assume if your intentions are good, the problem is going to solve itself. It won't. It takes a lot of implementation to make this work.
But certainly sharing of technologies in this area would be beneficial. Sharing of technologies to protect cities, creating smarter cities. We've seen floods right here in New York. We've seen terrible floods in China, where we've seen significant deaths in the metro. So kind of sharing technologies in that area would certainly be useful. And we're seeing an energy crisis, a power shortage in China, which is based upon, I think, their attempt to wean themselves off of fossil fuels and go to alternative energy. That's part of it.
Exactly. For them, they're facing a similar situation. Coal is going down, and they don't have quite the supply of what. But
that's part of the reason. Yeah.
Some part of this, yes, you're right. Best practices is the way I would put it with regard to urban policy, with regard to flood control, hurricanes. There's a role for competition of ideas. If Chinese companies are trying one technique for battery storage and U.S. companies are trying one, that's good old-fashioned capitalism.
Yeah.
And you will end up with more interesting optimal solutions if they are actually competing against each other.
Yeah. In your recent book, you talk about kind of the impact of the varying impacts of COVID. I got something years ago. I always believed that climate change and economic crisis and terrorism and pandemic would bring the United States and China together. It would force us to cooperate. Didn't happen with COVID. What happened, and what are the implications of it for U.S.-China relations?
It's a great question, because I too would have guessed that something like the pandemic could have had that effect. And I think two things happened, and it's one of those kind of, some parts of history are determined by large structural forces, and sometimes there is the accident, the peculiarity that makes things go in the direction they go. The peculiarity here was the COVID started in China, and the Chinese were very secretive and deceptive about it in its origins. I should point out, most countries, when an epidemic has started in that country, tend to be a little bit reluctant to share information. They feel guilty, they're defensive. If you look at SARS, MERS, Ebola, all of these have that characteristic. But in China, I think it was more pronounced because it is a very secretive, top-down, closed, command Leninist party. So there's no question. That poisoned the atmosphere. The second piece is that the Trump administration massively miscalculated in its COVID strategy. It thought that the virus would go away. It thought that any kind of economic lockdown would be foolish and not worth doing. It sort of took it was not an entirely crazy idea. It took the view that, look, we'll ride this out. The virus will wane the way that SARS did wane and MERS did wane, but they turned out to be wrong. So they confronted a full-blown pandemic, and then Trump's basic response to everything is blame somebody else. And so the whole Trump strategy became blame China, poison relations. Until then, he had been playing this schizophrenic game where one day he loved Xi, one day he bashed him. The COVID thing completely transformed it. And Trump is very good with public opinion, and he knew exactly how to play it, to turn the pandemic into the China virus, the Wuhan flu, all that kind of thing. And that took us in a place where cooperation became impossible. I mean, it's strange because the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union cooperated to jointly inoculate the world from smallpox. And the eradication of smallpox was an extraordinary example of superpower cooperation at the height of the Cold War. This was in the 50s, so pre the arms control. This was at the point where people thought the United States and the Soviet Union could fight a nuclear war. And at that very point, they were cooperating on global public health.
Yeah.
We can't do it right now.
Yeah, it was one of the disappointments. We, of course, had reduced our medical presence in China. Prior to that, we had people from our CDC embedded in China's CDC, from our National Science Foundation, and in 2017 and 18 they got withdrawn, which didn't help us understand what had occurred when COVID started.
And Steve, that's an important point about how to influence China. This is a huge country, civilization, 5,000 years old, now very rich and powerful. Some part of how we will get them to do things we think are right and not do bad things is going to be deterrence, is to be strong, be tough, push back. But some of it surely is also going to be cooperation, being there, involving ourselves, getting to know people, getting to as you said, our CDC, their CDC, our SEC working with their SEC. For two reasons. One, you do build some trust and goodwill. Secondly, you have some familiarity with what's going on in that place. And finally, they don't want to break the bonds either. They also, interdependence creates a certain kind of asymmetrical power for you. They don't want to get it all to be cut off and isolated. So the threat of pulling people out could be one of your bargaining chips. If we isolate them completely, if we isolate ourselves completely, we lose much leverage over them. I mean, one of the things that I've always pointed out to people is we keep sanctioning countries with whom we have no contact. North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, and then Cuba, and then we're surprised that the sanctions don't work. Well, they don't hurt very much if the countries actually have very little dealing with one another. So keeping the bonds actually in a weird way gives us more leverage.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about trade and investment. As you've pointed out, it's enormous and so important. And let's go back to the Obama years when Obama had led the negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a high standard trade and investment agreement. Secretary Clinton and President Trump decided they were going to withdraw from it, and then President Trump won the election, and he did withdraw from it. As you pointed out in a wonderful story, the day after the United States announced its partnership with Australia and the United Kingdom to provide Australia for, I think, $60 billion with nuclear-propelled subs, China, the day after, applied for accession to what was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's kind of got amended somewhat, and it now exists with 11 countries, including Australia and Japan, some of our closest allies. You and I believe this is a big deal, but people don't much share our view. Why? What's going on here?
Well, economics always kind of goes under the radar. Trade economics in particular is so arcane and complicated and obscure that people don't pay attention. But of course, it is often the big thing that undergirds relations. So, it's possible that what's going on here is that the Chinese realized that the real threat that they faced was not an American aircraft carrier, but was that the United States was bringing together all the major economies in Asia in this Trans-Pacific Partnership, which were then going to have a kind of counterweight to China, and we're going to be able to write the agenda, write the rules, whether it's intellectual property, trade practices and such. And so once America foolishly, in a sense, commits the own goal of withdrawing from a trade treaty that it had sponsored, imagined, dreamed up, corralled these other 11 countries into doing, the Chinese were like, well, maybe we should get involved. Now, I don't think China will be led into the TPP, but it's a kind of clever move, and it highlights the cost that the United States is paying in not being part of the TPP. The TPP basically opened up markets like Japan to America that had long been closed. It actually had many concessions on wages, on environmental issues that the left wanted and were able to get. It's a remarkably progressive trade treaty, but again, Trump poisoned the atmosphere so much that it became impossible to get out of it. If things continue to go south, though, I do think the Chinese will, whether formally through the mechanism of joining the TPP or not, they will take advantage. If America retreats more and more into isolation and protectionism, the Chinese benefit because the rest of the world can't afford to do that. The U.S. is still a vast domestic economy. We think we're very globalized. We're not. 80% of the U.S. economy is a domestic economy. Trade is only 20% of our economy. But you go to Thailand, you go to Malaysia, you go to Singapore, you go to Taiwan, these countries are entirely dependent on trade. Even Germany, 50% of German GDP is trade.
But you're thinking that China will never get in, or will not get in for the next decade?
There's a provision in there that says non-market economies can't join, and there is significant, I think there's enough reality to China not having a real market economy. And secondly, given where the Australians are and the Japanese are right now, they would veto it, is my guess. I think it would take either significant reforms or significant cajoling from the Chinese. I think the Chinese have, we've talked a lot about American policy. Xi has fundamentally misunderstood how to handle his Asian neighbors. I think that the Xi approach has been be very strong, be very tough, and you will command their respect. It's not working. It's having exactly the opposite impact. I can tell you, intimately knowing the India story, the Indians were really not very anti-Chinese. They were being pushed by the U.S. to get more involved with the Quad. And then Xi launches this skirmish in the Himalayas, this border.
So it's not clear what happened.
It's not clear what happened.
We don't know what happened. Nobody's explained it well.
What we know is that the Chinese and the Indians fought hand to hand because they'd been luckily told not to use weapons. The Chinese ended up with 20 square miles of additional territory. But this is like frozen wasteland tundra territory. I don't know what they would do with it. But as a result, it completely changed India's foreign policy toward China. They banned hundreds of Chinese apps. They've essentially banned all Chinese investment into the country. And they are now much more actively participating, even at a defense level, with the Quad. So I would put it to Xi Jinping, was it worth it? You got 20 miles of frozen tundra and you changed, the foreign policy of 1.2 to 1.3 billion people.
I would argue the same with respect to the South China Sea,
right.
That the consequences of China's actions in the South China Sea and the benefits that they derive don't outweigh the costs right. that it's created
entirely
in terms
right.
of unifying the Asian countries with the United States in opposition to China's
right. There's a familiar dynamic in international relations, which is balancing. Countries first try to balance against a rising power, rising threat. Only if they feel they cannot balance, then they jump on the bandwagon. So the truth is, because of America in large part, these countries can balance. They can balance China. And so as long as that dynamic is at play, with China, Deng Xiaoping was very wise. When he outlined China's relations to the world and sort of said, hide your light under a bushel. I think it wasn't just that he was saying we're weak right now. I think Deng understood that China is not the United States. The United States grew to great world power surrounded by two vast oceans and two weak neighbors. Right? Sorry to the Mexicans and Canadians listening. China is growing rich and powerful in the middle of Asia. It has 16 border neighbors and 16 border disputes, and all these countries watch the rise of China and they get anxious, and managing that rise is a task worthy of a Bismarck, and Xi Jinping is no Bismarck.
Why? And then I want to get off of CPTPP, but during the Obama administration, national security professionals, so our armed forces, the Secretary of Defense said that, joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership was more valuable than a bunch of aircraft carrier groups, that it really created another pillar for America's presence in Asia. There's really silence today from our national security professionals on that. Some of the, folks who work on economics said this would be good for America. The net growth in jobs is easy to quantify. This would be good. But there's not a bunch of national security folks who said this would be great for what the first questioner asks, our pivot to Asia.
I think it's an important question, and it's fundamentally because trade has become a dirty word in Washington. Because everybody thinks that it is by focusing on trade and globalization and neglecting the American worker whose wages have declined, that is what got us Donald Trump, that is what got us this wave of populism, and so everyone is sort of genuflecting to what they see as this political atmosphere. The truth is, the United States did not open itself up blindly to trade over the last 20 years. We have actually not opened up our economy as much as other countries. We're the laggard. And as I said, we have more protectionist measures in place. Many of those, by the way, are what hurt American workers. And one of the reasons for the decline in wages actually has to do with the fact that we weren't keeping pace with the rest of the world. The big number everyone talks about is this one China study that found 2 million jobs. American manufacturing workers lost 2 million jobs because of what is called the China shock. Nobody read the study. That's over 15 years. Okay, that comes to about 150,000 jobs every year. Now, do you know how many jobs American workers lose every year through the normal churning of the American economy? 60 million. So this is 150,000 jobs out of 60 million that are lost every year through all kinds of reasons. Now, some of those are voluntary. People resign, people move locations. But even if you take it, there's a very good calculation done by the International Institute for International Economics. It basically comes to the conclusion that for every job lost to trade with China, there were 150 other jobs lost by American workers to technology, to productivity gains, to all kinds of other things. None of those people have been, none of those job losses have become the center of American political debate. And it's important to point out, when we talk about manufacturing jobs, because that's what we're talking about with China, those were the 2 million lost. Manufacturing has been a shrinking percent of the American workforce for 75 years. We've been going down, down, down. If you look at Germany, a country that has a trade surplus that supports manufacturing, manufacturing is at the heart of the German economy. The decline in manufacturing in Germany is the same as the United States, in some areas even worse. And guess what? What country is now seeing a decline in manufacturing jobs? China. Since 2012, manufacturing jobs have been declining in China. Why? Because as countries move up the economic ladder, they shift from goods-based economies to services. And when you move up into services, you're losing manufacturing jobs. We produce more. This is, again, one of the things people don't understand. We make more stuff than we ever did before. Manufacturing output in America is higher than it's ever been. We just need fewer people to do it.
I want to get to some of the soft power issues. Amanda from Los Angeles has asked a question about soft power. So if we could hear her question.
Hi, my name is Amanda Walensevich, and I have a question about American soft power. American cultural products, whether that's film, TV, or pop music, have allowed people around the world, and especially in China, to learn about American society and values. However, today it's becoming increasingly difficult to access American media in China. What might the long-term implications of this trend be? Or, to put it differently, what will happen if America continues to lose its ability to leverage its soft power in China?
It's a good question. Two forces are at work. One is that China has become more closed under Xi Jinping and is, in a sense, kind of decoupling itself from particularly the intellectual, cultural world in that way. I mean, you mentioned my books. Every one of my books was translated into mainland China until this last one. Before that, they would often ask for, edits. There's a few paragraphs on Mao. They would want to cut those out, and I would wrestle with it. And I came to the conclusion better to have it out there in China, and I would have them append a note saying this book has been specially edited for the Chinese market, with making it clear that this was an abridged version of the book. But that is no longer possible. So you can see a marked closing down of the Chinese system. The second piece that we should not underestimate is China is developing a huge popular culture of its own. So one of the things that I was struck by 10 years ago, this is when China was still very much opening up and liberalizing, was that you'd go to China and you'd talk to people there and you'd realize what we thought of as the biggest rock stars of the world, singers in the world, movie actors, they were unknown in China. The biggest music people were all Chinese. They did know some of our very biggest people, Britney Spears or Madonna or Taylor Swift now and people like that. But the vast majority of the entertainment space is now Chinese, and that is happening all over the world. Bollywood movies are 95% of the Indian market now. Korean popular culture is massively popular, not just in Korea and other places. And this is, it's a wonderful phenomenon. You're seeing the rise of the rest, as I call it, the cultural renaissance of these places. Often they're copying a lot of American formats. So there's a Korean version of Friends and a Korean version of Modern Family and things like that, but in their own idiom and speaking their own language and things like that. And in that sense, we are losing a certain kind of cultural power. Look, the United States defined modernity for much of the world. When I was growing up in India, you watched American movies and sitcoms and music to understand what modernity was, because America was the face of modernity. Well, now modernity has many faces. There is a Chinese face to modernity, there's a Korean face to modernity, there is an Australian face, and that's a good thing. We want a society, we want a world in which lots of people are doing well. Our greatest soft power was the image and the strength of our democratic system. That's the one I worry about. I don't care if people are watching American sitcoms or watching Korean sitcoms. What I worry about is that people don't respect the American system of government as being something that at the end of the day, secretly, aspirationally, everybody thinks this is where we should get to. That was very much part of every country's DNA, other than Europe, of course, which has had its own path, but that we've lost.
We're not going to be able to get to nearly all of our questions. I had questions on Taiwan and other questions, but let me just close with two quick questions. One, from your perspective, what is one common sense recommendation you'd make to the leadership in either or both countries to improve the relationship going forward?
I'd probably do two. One is that they should set up more regular meetings between the senior officials. I am a strong believer in this, as Churchill said, better to jaw than war. Having actual contact would make a big difference. And I would say the second one is try to be sensible and commonsensical about the economic relationship, which is clearly can proceed on a win-win platform, which is to say it is better for Americans and it's better for Chinese people if we were able to trade more, to engage in more economic activity. Think of the opposite. Imagine if China collapsed as an economy right now. It would plunge the United States into a recession. Why is that good for us? Why is it good for us to have a world in which fewer people can buy and sell and invest? And so try to decouple that from the genuine and legitimate issues that you have about Chinese predatory behavior or South China Sea, as you say. Try to preserve there are positive parts of the relationship that are positive for both the citizens of the US and China and for the citizens of the world. Try to husband the good while also dealing with the bad.
Last question comes from Webster Lewing from New Jersey. And he asked something which will be asked at all of the 88 venues that are going to be watching this or that are watching this live. What can ordinary citizens do to prevent a new Cold War between the United States and China, as we discussed at the very beginning of this broadcast?
It's a great question, and it's a very difficult one to answer because, generally Americans don't vote on foreign policy. They essentially delegate foreign policy to the executive branch. Even Congress doesn't tend to get too involved, though on China they have gotten very involved. The average person, I think, my feeling has always been that we somehow don't get people who have common sense, who are practical, who are pragmatic, to be as energized, as vociferous, as active in the political sphere as the crazies. People who have passionate intensity on one side or the other, highly ideological, highly extreme views. Think of the primary voters in the Republican and the Democratic Party, who are usually 10% of the voting. And now we've gotten to the point where it's Twitter, which is 10% of that 10%. And somehow they frame the debate, they frame the dialogue, and everyone runs scared of getting a series of angry tweets from somebody or getting primary voters upset. But there's this vast middle of the country of people who are sensible, pragmatic, and I think for all those listening who I think are so inclined, you've got to get more active. You've got to approach this with the same level of intensity as the people on the far right and the far left, because if you don't do that, your voice gets drowned out. Your preferences are not taken seriously. And all I think people should be asking for is, let's just be sensible about this. There's a way to compete with China, to confront China, and to cooperate with China within an overall strategic relationship that recognizes we're not going anywhere and we're not going to give up on our values. But they also have, they're also going to have a place at the table. China has been around for 5,000 years. It's going to be around for a while.
I think that's a perfect way to end, because that's what the China Town Hall is all about. It's about getting Americans to learn about China, and when they learn about China, to learn more about China, learn more about what U.S.-China relations mean for them at home, and to take that information and talk to your congressman, talk to your senator, talk to your governor. And that's the point. And you have done a fabulous job in educating all of the folks who are watching us tonight. I thank you for engaging in this terrific conversation. And I want to thank our audience, too, for asking some terrific questions. Please be sure to visit the National Committee's website and YouTube channel for the full recording of this event and for our other excellent programming. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great, whether it's your morning, noon, or night, have a great day. And thank you again, Fareed.
Thank you, Steve.
Hi, welcome back. So I hope that was an interesting presentation to watch. I actually had thought that it would be more of a speech and less of an interview, but I thought it was pretty good as such an interview, and it's generated some good questions from among those in attendance tonight. So first up is likening current US-China relations with the Cold War era as self-fulfilling prophecy. It might be. And that's part of the issue, right? If we remain trapped in thinking that we're definitely in a bipolar world. And I noted, interestingly, speaking of sort of cognitive templates or soft power, Fareed Zakaria said win-win about 15 times, but then he also said bipolarity is a given and couldn't seem to shake this idea that we're headed into a bipolar world. And if it's a bipolar world, I'm still not convinced that if we accept that premise, we're able to think of a bipolar world of cooperation. I mean, he cited in the interview the example of the United States and the USSR working together to eradicate smallpox. That is something, and sort of a big vaccination drive. I'm negatively impressed that right now we're all of us not working terribly well together to distribute COVID vaccines that have been developed with such remarkable speed and accuracy, right? Even to the point where the UK and the EU earlier this year and at the end of last year were fighting with each other over vaccinations, let alone the way that the rest of the world has responded to China's vaccine development and deployment and the way that China's looked at other countries and their vaccines. So, I'm not terribly convinced that if we are thinking we're headed into bipolarity, that we can really have cooperation. But I think if we assume that's where we're going and that path is preordained and irrevocable, it may well be self-fulfilling. And then do you think that the post-pandemic global order would be a natural development in a multipolar system of cooperation based on managing all of these various crises? I'm also not convinced of that. That's kind of the mirror image of the first question. That'd be great, right? If everybody just got along and we had a multipolar world in which everybody cooperated and we solved all these tremendous problems like climate change and global health issues, environmental protection. I mean, we'd all love that. We can imagine a world maybe where that will happen, but I'm not sure that we're going to get there at any point in the near future, if only that were really possible. But I guess it doesn't hurt to be a dreamer in that respect. Is it possible to follow through with punitive or hostile policy towards China, given the West's commitment to working with China on certain global issues such as climate change? Yeah, I mean, this is part of the issue that was brought up actually in the interview just now by Fareed Zakaria at a couple points, which is that substantial trade links, substantial sort of cultural links, human interaction links make it harder to disengage, right? It means very little to sanction a country with which you have almost no trade. It's very difficult to disengage from a country where you watch each other's TV shows and listen to each other's pop music and trade $2 billion a day with one another, seemed to be part of his point. But I'm also not convinced that trade and other areas of cooperation and linkage necessarily outweigh confrontation or disengagement in the security sphere. And I've been arguing for a long time that US-China security cooperation or confrontation has been driven historically, if we look across the kind of long arc of history, going all the way back at least to the Second World War, if not even before, by the presence or absence of what we could call a common enemy. And by common enemy, I don't mean just, something that both countries don't like or some other country that both countries don't like, but a real kind of existential threat to both of them. Thinking in particular of two countries at different points in history, Japan and the USSR, right? So during World War II, the United States and China were allies, and strong allies, important allies in both cases. They were allies not because they just had some great affinity for one another since time immemorial, but rather very specifically because they were both under very substantial, one could say, existential threat from Japan. Right. And so they're sort of pushed together into this alliance at that point. Similarly, in the 1970s, 1980s, the United States and China worked together very, very closely in security areas, both directly to confront the Soviet Union and indirectly through sort of proxy actions such as arming groups in Afghanistan and Mujahideen, some of which later became Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but working to arm and equip those groups collectively, along with some others such as Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, was a common security policy of the United States and China during the 1980s. Other areas of security cooperation were quite substantial. I mean, during the Reagan administration, the US was actually selling and licensing substantial military technology to China, surprisingly enough, right? So we see these moments and areas of security cooperation when there's a common threat, and a common threat of substantial magnitude. At other points, when threats emerge that they try to define as common, that cooperation is thinner and more short-lived. So an example of that would be global terrorism after September 11th. Both China and the United States tried to confront this threat. Both set aside other security problems that had been festering through the 1990s, basically since the collapse of the USSR, to a great degree, set these aside. But eventually it became clear they couldn't agree on who a terrorist was, right? There were groups and entities and individuals in Central Asia and other parts of the world that the United States regarded as terrorists that China didn't, and importantly, vice versa. And this is still a major point of contention between the two countries, where China thought that, or labeled at least certain groups or individuals as terrorists, and the United States did not agree at all. So it becomes more difficult when we talk about these kind of non-traditional threats versus states or other easier to define entities in the international system in terms of thinking about common enemies. If we think about trade cooperation and further integration on trade, this also came up, but obliquely in the interview, when the subject of domestic politics in the United States was raised. This idea that moving forward with globalization and neglecting the working class led to the rise of populism and Donald Trump. Even if we set that completely aside, what I think is really important to highlight here is that we had very different domestic political coalitions in power with very different motivations for engaging or not engaging with the international economy at different points in history. So Bill Clinton was notable for the coalition that he built of business interests, technology interests, highly educated voters, urban elites, and capital, as opposed to the traditional Democratic coalition that was much more focused on rural voters and the working class. He did this around an ideology that put free trade front and center. And many of Clinton's most important foreign policy initiatives were, in fact, around building free trade and networks of trade around the world, from NAFTA to all kinds of other arrangements. That was an aberration for a Democratic president in the United States. There have been others on the right and the left who've gone in that direction, others who've withdrawn. In China, too, we see very different postures towards the international economy. For example, between the leadership groups during the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping, or the 1990s during the Jiang Zemin era, which were generally very much pro-globalization, pro-free trade, even at the expense of economic sectors and social groups within China who suffered from the effects of free trade. Versus, for example, today, Xi Jinping's coalition, or even that of Hu Jintao, which are much more focused on internal trade and politics, much more focused on protecting or salvaging, resurrecting those groups that have been hurt by trade, much more wary of engaging in comprehensive trading regimes or in trading groups, and much more critical of the international world trade system. So what I would argue is that only when both the United States and China are governed by coalitions that believe free trade and globalization to be in their own best interest for their domestic political agendas, only then do we see real growth in the integration of trade and other kinds of exchanges. So during the 1990s, despite all the security problems in Taiwan and elsewhere between the United States and China after the demise of the Soviet Union, we actually saw very close economic cooperation and dramatic expansion of trade and investment, because, I would argue, Bill Clinton and Jiang Zemin were both firmly committed to globalization and free trade for their own sake. and the other country happened to be a very important partner in that. Today, we don't see that at all. We see quite the opposite. So I'm not convinced that working together on trade will necessarily drive the US or China closer together on security matters. I'm also not convinced that confrontation on security would necessarily end closer integration on trade or other global issues. I think they kind of operate as independent dimensions to some degree. Where I do think that there may be some check on this is that complete disengagement from China or full-on confrontation with China for the United States or other Western countries would be economically disastrous. And I think they know that. The governments of those countries know that. I think China knows that. I think it would be equally, if not more disastrous for China to do something similar. And I think the Chinese government also appreciates that. So it may serve as something of a check on just how far we can go down a road towards bipolar confrontation or competition. Next question says, if the quote unquote Thucydides trap were to be reversed, could China be more of a danger as a declining power? And that's an interesting question. I mean, I always love this term that keeps getting brought up, the Thucydides trap. As best as I can trace that, that goes to the otherwise very respectable political scientist, Graham Allison at Harvard, who coined this term and started saying that the rising power of China is definitely going to pose a threat to the status quo hegemon of the United States, such that there will be a bipolar competition, leading perhaps to overall confrontation or even war. It's essentially another catchier phrase, iteration of Mearsheimer's tragedy of great power politics argument. What's interesting about it, though, is that I don't think Graham Allison, with all due respect, or others who like this term, have read or reread carefully the history of the Peloponnesian War. In it, in book 1, the Athenian historian Thucydides spells out very clearly Athens caused the war, not Sparta, right? Athens was the upstart power, the democracy, the sort of more liberal cosmopolitan player, not the authoritarian revisionist power of that sort. Right? It was Athens that was actually the more revisionist power in this case, right? So I think this whole idea of Thucydides trap maybe should be relabeled in some way. But if we think about it in the reverse scenario that I think the questioner is implying, that if China is in fact declining rather than increasing in strength, might it pose a greater threat to the United States or to sort of global order? An interesting question. Many seem to be wrestling with this in various governments around the world. It's not obvious to me what the answer is. I think what is clear is that we're less likely to see bipolar competition if indeed China is a declining or stagnating power, right? In other words, if China is now 15% of GDP and it never gets to 20%, if it goes back down to 10 or even 8, let's say. If China continues to spend at its current rate on the military and continues to sort of exist at roughly the same level of military capability that it has now, which is very substantial, but doesn't increase while other countries increase, I think in this scenario, we are less likely to settle into a protracted stalemate of bipolar competition, such as we saw between the 1950s and the 1980s with the United States and the Soviet Union. That being said, this goes back to our original sets of assumptions and templates. If we opt for the view of most American scholars of international relations, yes, this is more dangerous, more unstable, harder to get a handle on, harder to predict, and more likely to lead to conflict than a bipolar competition in which at least we can predict and have some stability as to the relationships. Forgetting, of course, all of those messy proxy wars in places like Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, right? So as long as we ignore that, the Cold War was actually an era of great stability where mutually assured destruction made certain that both sides didn't destroy each other. However, in a multipolar world, we don't have those assurances. It's much more likely that we could lead we could find ourselves inadvertently in a conflagration like World War I, the classic example in a lot of this same IR scholarship, where miscalculations, misinformation, and misunderstanding in a very complex and fluid balance of power world lead to an unintended war. If, on the other hand, though, we move more towards the view held by many Chinese scholars and analysts of international relations, they tend to often think that a multipolar world is inevitable. No country will dominate the international system the way that, for example, the British Empire did during the Victorian era, or the United States did during the 1950s and 60s. Right? There's no country that's going to be that dominant ever again. Not China, not the United States, no one else. On the other hand, we're almost certain, according to this view, to see the rise of multiple powers. And they won't all be equally matched, right? It is not reasonable to think that Russia, China, United States, India, Japan, all of these powers are going to be equally powerful. They won't be. But they'll all be powerful enough that none can dominate the system or consolidate one or two poles. In this view, that multipolar balance of power world is not just inevitable, but perhaps a desirable equilibrium position. I'm not sure who's right. I have no way to predict or to say with certainty, is the overall consensus, at least among realists in the United States, correct, or is the consensus among many Chinese scholars correct? But if one is correct versus the other, it changes how we predict this, right? How we know how dangerous or not dangerous a declining or stagnant China would be. In the multipolar world, a stagnant China is less dangerous than the rising China, because it allows us to settle more quickly into some kind of multipolar equilibrium. In the bipolar world, or the sort of world in which bipolarity is more stable, the declining or stagnant China is far more dangerous. So first we have to sort of select our lens or worldview for studying the international system. Once we've done that, we can then adjudicate between whether we think China is more or less dangerous if it's declining versus rising. So the next question says, how should the US or the broader West react to the recent reaffirmation by Xi Jinping of China's desire to retake Taiwan? Well, China has always seen Taiwan as part of China. Both Chinese governments see it as such, including the Republic of China government based in Taipei. So it's not as though this new statement that, yes, Taiwan is part of China and cannot be separated and must reunify, that this is anything new, right? The prime minister in the late 1990s, Zhu Rongji, used to literally pound the table and shake his fist and threaten to invade Taiwan with military force at a moment's notice, should things not go the way that the Chinese government wanted them to. It's also the case that in the 1990s, the several political parties in Taiwan, including the Democratic Progressive Party, which now holds the presidency and a substantial block of seats in the legislature in Taiwan, had advocated directly for formal declaration of independence and the establishment of what they call the Republic of Taiwan. The Democratic Progressive Party and most mainstream Taiwanese political parties no longer make that case nearly as vociferously or adroitly as they did 25 or 30 years ago. In this context, I'm not convinced, in other words, that the current situation over Taiwan is more tense or more acute than it had been, say, in the 1990s. And the 1990s were probably less tense and less acute in terms of the Taiwan Straits crisis than the 1950s, where we saw two rounds of Straits crises, including shelling and blockades and all kinds of other things like this, dogfights between MiGs and F-16s or whatever the earlier generation of US fighters were at the time. Nothing like that's happening now, although there have been some very provocative and aggressive moves of sending many airplanes into Taiwan's self-declared air defense zone. And there have been scrambling of planes against that. And there's been a lot of rhetoric sort of heating up on both sides. I don't think this is such a major shift or change or the crisis that some in the media are making it out to be. That said, what is shifting, and shifting not that slowly over the last few decades and continues to shift, is the relative balance of power between Taiwan and mainland China, such that in the 1990s, it would have been very difficult for China to retake Taiwan by military force. It is considerably less difficult now, although not easy. We're still talking about something that would be a protracted conflict involving many, many, many casualties, many of them civilians in Taiwanese cities, people who the Chinese government claims as their own citizens. So it would be incredibly difficult and costly in human terms, as well as in strictly military and economic terms, to try to retake Taiwan by force, or to take Taiwan by force. So I don't think that we're likely to see armed conflict breaking out in the Taiwan Strait imminently. That said, I also think that from the point of view of the US has indeed been the main guarantor or backer of Taiwan's security through an ingenious arrangement called the Taiwan Relations Act that was passed by the US Congress almost immediately upon the establishment of formal diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. This legislation commits the United States to assisting Taiwan militarily to help defend itself, and has been the bedrock of that security relationship for the past 40 years. It has weakened, I would say, in the past couple of decades in several important ways. Notably, the George W. Bush administration began to walk back from the earlier US policy of strategic ambiguity over Taiwan. And also, over about the last 15 years, arms sales and other security assistance to Taiwan from the United States appear to have declined somewhat, or at least they have not kept pace with what one might have thought Taiwan's defense needs actually necessitated, especially given the buildup by the mainland just across the strait, as well as the overall expansion of air and naval power of the PLA. So there is that issue as sort of in the background. The other aspect is other countries, the key other player here being Japan. Japan has frequently gone further out on a limb, so to speak, to back Taiwan or to voice support for Taiwan's security than the United States has. It's continuing to do so. What is less clear is what else Japan might be prepared to do to assist Taiwan. And as Japanese politics evolve and Japan's own relationship with its own sort of constitution, as well as with the United States in security terms, evolves, it may be that Japan becomes a more important player in this interaction as well. That I don't know what exact influence that would have on the stability or instability of the cross-straits relationship. Next, there's a question that says, should Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East's friendly relations with China inform Western policy towards China? Yes and no, I would say. Yes, in the fact that Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, that's a lot of the world, isn't it? Africa alone is 55 countries and over 1 billion people. Latin America, we're talking about vast land area, as well as something like 400 million people, I think, at least. Across all of Latin America, essentially everything from the US south to Tierra del Fuego. Middle East, I mean, also a very important region, especially if we count North Africa. It's also huge geographically and population-wise. So we should definitely care about what all of these countries and regions are doing vis-a-vis China. And if they have very friendly relations with China, that's important, right? We have to take account of that. No matter what we think about that, why that might be happening, what other aspects that might be behind that, what types of soft power deployment there could or might not be, how complex the different relationships really are, right? And I think we need to be very careful to parse with some refinement the types of relationships that we label as friendly in these parts of the world. For example, the relations between China and specific countries in Africa vary a great deal. In some cases, it really is about resource extraction or access to certain resources. In many other cases, it's actually about long-term political relationships between governments, where there have been 50 years in some cases of friendly relations between particular regimes in African states and the PRC. And in probably the overwhelming majority of cases, it's really about just trade. There are certain products that can be supplied very well by China that are demanded in many African economies. There are certain projects that can be bid for by, for example, Chinese construction firms, and in which those bids are the most competitive. They can do it cheaper and faster and better than other companies. So it really is, in many cases, I think, purely about business. If we look to Latin American countries, similarly, we see the whole gamut of different kinds of relationships. In places like Venezuela and Cuba, there are political considerations that are not there with a relationship, say, of Brazil or Mexico. In a place like Chile, there are clearly mineral considerations and other natural resources. In other economies, the relationship is more multifaceted, for example, in Argentina. So, we actually see quite a bit of dynamics across this, friendly, not friendly, different kinds of friendliness, different dimensions of cooperation or lack of cooperation. The Middle East, likewise, incredibly complex, many different countries involved for many different reasons. So even if, though, all of these countries became much more friendly to China, it's not obvious that the United States or the European Union or the UK would necessarily benefit by sort of following on, jumping on a bandwagon led by developing states. It might be that sort of trying to entice them back away from China might be a policy that the US has thought about doing, said they were going to do, for example, even in parts of the world at different times over the last decade or two, hasn't really done very effectively. There are long-standing ties between European states and certain states in the developing world, largely former colonies, some of which could be reinvigorated, expanded, and revamped and repaired, frankly, in ways that could perhaps entice those countries to be less closely tied to China, if that's something that the European countries were to decide is in their interest. So it's not obvious to me that there's one relationship that should drive this, or one policy direction in which this could go, but it's absolutely important, I think, for the US, UK, and other Western states to take account of what developing countries are doing and not to neglect their role as players in the international system. I think there's a few more questions that have come in. Yes, there are. I'm cognizant also that we're beginning to run out of time, so I'll try to go through these a bit more quickly. So next we have, would a democratic China be more hostile if it had to respond to and appease voters? Very hard to say. It's hard to say to what degree a country is democratic just by virtue of having votes, and to what degree a fully open and liberal society is required to have real democracy. And so if we're talking about China as an illiberal democracy in some respect, however that might be constituted, it's hard to say what voters would decide or how they could be manipulated. If we speak of China as a liberal democracy, that would be such a fundamental sea change in Chinese politics that I really don't know how public opinion would shape around different possible options or trajectories. It certainly is possible, though, that even if China becomes some kind of wonderful, open, liberal, free democracy of the kind that many in the West might dream about, it may well be that the voters don't exactly like the policies or relationships that those Western advocates would want them to. Right? And this is true not only in China, but lots of places. People become a little bit less enamored of democracy in the West when non-Western countries become democratic and then don't vote for the options that the Western backers would have liked them to. I think particularly of about 15 years ago when voters in Gaza voted for Hamas. Right? This is they voted in what I could, as far as I could tell, as a not particularly expert observer at all, just from media reports, they seem to vote in a very open and fair election. They voted for a party that was absolutely detested by the United States and all of the other Western powers that were sort of pushing so hard for democracy to be implemented in this area. That absolutely could happen in China. So it's hard for me to say with any certainty whether that's more likely or it's more likely that some other government would come into power that would be more pro-Western or pro-US if there were to be this huge sea change in Chinese politics being the counterfactual. So is China more of a non-market economy than Vietnam, which is part of the CPTPP? I'm not sure how to address that in very general terms. That would be a whole topic for a book or a very, very long discussion, but it's a good question. I actually would spin this in a slightly different direction, apologies to the questioner, and say that all of these treaty frameworks, the CPTPP and the TPP before it, are less than they may appear, right? They're smaller and weaker than they may appear. And the reason I say that is this. If we look back at the TPP, the original Trans-Pacific Partnership, most of the states that had to make serious changes under its framework were not going to be able to get in very quickly, at least, including Vietnam, right? That it was going to take quite a while for them to be able fully to participate under the terms of the treaty. It was also true, notably, that almost all the countries had free trade already with each other and with the United States under the original Trans-Pacific Partnership. So what was the purpose of this Trans-Pacific Partnership? Well, maybe tying it all together, maybe actually trying to raise labor and environmental standards in parts of Southeast Asia. The other aspect, though, that everybody seemed to leave out in the media discussion at the time, thinking back now, 12, 15 years, whenever that was, later part of the Obama administration, the only two countries in that framework that didn't already have free trade with one another were the United States and Japan. So essentially, the TPP was a free trade agreement between the United States and Japan. Now that's huge for the United States and Japan on their own and for the rest of Asia and the world economy. But it's not the same thing as a comprehensive partnership of 25 countries to confront China, et cetera, et cetera. No, it really was this bilateral trade relationship that was clearly the most important. And in that light, what surprised me the most was after Trump rejected the Trans-Pacific Partnership and pulled the United States out, almost immediately afterwards, he hosted the Prime Minister of Japan at the time at Mar-a-Lago. And while there, they discussed all kinds of security things, right? Famously, all these maps on the tables about North Korea and so on. But while there, they could have hammered out, I think, some kind of a framework for a free trade bilateral agreement between the United States and Japan, but they didn't. That surprised me very much, because that would have been, to use the preferred term from the Chinese government, win-win, right? That's clearly a win-win solution that would have allowed the US government to save face by pulling out of TPP, but also to reap the main substantive and economic gains by actually signing that deal with Japan if they had been able to move in that direction. But they didn't. I don't know exactly why. It'll be interesting if there are any documents from those meetings, when and if they become publicly available in another decade or two, what actually happened and why. But so I think, in other words, the CPTPP is less important than it appears. If China does get into it, it's even less important still, again, because China already has free trade with almost all the countries that will be in it. And with China in it and the weakening overall, therefore, of other standards that it would otherwise impose or might otherwise impose, just makes it even a weaker system than already there. Next, are state-owned enterprises a model for economic development? Well, I don't think so. For a whole number of reasons. I would refer you actually to my first book back from 2009 about the labor consequences or the consequences for labor of continuing to try to rely on state-owned enterprises in a market-driven economy of the sort that China has been trying to undertake for about the last 20 years. So still a couple more questions, and I think this may be the last one or two before we have to end. So we have here, can we take America's recent withdrawal from Afghanistan, coupled with China's Belt and Road Initiative, South China Sea man-made islands, amongst other things, as evidence of the beginning of an underlying shift in the international security or power system? Oh, nice, small, easy question for the last one. This is another one that's worthy of a sort of book-length treatise or very extended discussion. What I would say here is that America's withdrawal from Afghanistan was clearly not the finest hour for US soft power or hard power. It was shambolic in many respects and showcased all of the worst views, I think, of the United States, both to its friends and to its potential enemies. So definitely a huge loss for US power and interests. But what is interesting to look at from the other side, China's Belt and Road Initiative. Okay, One Belt, One Road is a funny little phrase that Xi Jinping has been putting out for about the last 8 years, under which he's tried to organize a lot of Chinese economic activity and initiatives in both Central Asia and Southeast Asia in particular, as well as to a lesser extent in South Asia and even parts of Africa and beyond. Is it actually doing anything much? That's a great big question mark, right? It's trying to channel some outbound investment. It's trying to move some unproductive investment out of China into other parts of the world where risks are higher, but returns might be a little bit better than the abysmally low returns generally available inside China. Ancillary to this, it's also seeking to try to build soft power in some of those countries. I would say on the first measures, I don't know how successful it's really been. I don't think the Chinese companies, which incidentally are mostly state-owned enterprises, involved in those investment plans have really made that much money off of them in most cases. In some cases, I do know they have lost really kind of staggering sums of money on some of these projects. The other thing that's happened is that the soft power initiative has backfired in a number of cases, notably in Indonesia, Malaysia, even in Myanmar, and it's in fact turned significant segments of public opinion against China rather than in favor of China, to the point where some of the projects have been canceled in really high profile and embarrassing ways. The South China Sea man-made islands, even more so. I think that the increasingly bellicose posture of China in the South China Sea, including the man-made islands, but not unique, not only or restricted to those, has made more enemies than friends, and is in fact causing many states to line up against China rather than with it. So is this the beginning of an overall power shift in the international system? Maybe, although I don't think it's the beginning. I think it's been underway for a while. I think China has, in very broad terms, moved from being what we might call a breaker, one who just tries to flout and undermine all rules and structures of the system, which it really was in the 1950s and 60s, and then to being a taker in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, in which, as referenced in the interview with Fareed Zakaria, the Chinese government and leadership essentially sought to downplay any kind of independent initiative and play by the rules in order to try to increase power in a softer way, and quieter way, more modest way, and then to be trying to become more of a maker in the new millennium. And by that, I mean participating actively in forums such as ASEAN Regional Forum, WTO, APEC, other kinds of framework, even the CPTPP, if and when that really comes to fruition, in order to try to shape the rules, in order to try to actually have a seat at the table and exert some influence proactively over what the rules and structures look like. And I think increasingly China is doing that, and others are listening. They're not always doing it in the best of ways or the most careful or elegant of ways. People are not always listening in ways that make them agree with China, but they're listening and paying attention. And I think what we're seeing in terms of a shift is more and more people listening and responding to what China is doing, and not necessarily less attention to the United States, but less clear direction of leadership from the US, and less of a recognition on the part of the rest of the world that the US is really the most important voice in the room, or only voice that needs to be heard in some cases. Okay, so I think we're out of time, unfortunately. I know 1 or 2 more questions just came in, but we are already over time. So I want to thank all of you very much for coming tonight, for attending this online town hall. I hope it has been useful, and good night.